It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I will be talking about Adam Smith and the digression of silver. The digression of silver is a digression, but is a very long digression in the Wealth of Nations. And is usually not read. It is usually discarded as a digression, as something long and boring. But I think instead that the digression of silver is one of the most important arguments Smith makes about mercantilism, and in particular about how wrong mercantilists are, and he proves it empirically. So a lot of the arguments in the Wealth of Nations are theoretically based, but in the digression of silver instead, I think Smith offers us an empirical dismantling of the mercantile arguments. Now, the reason why I think the digression of silver is important is because Smith can teach us through the digression that correlation is not causation. And I will explain why this is the case throughout the presentation. But one of the main play that the mercantilists use is correlation, and they infer causation, but for Smith, there is only correlation. So one lesson that we can learn from reading the digression of silver is that correlation is not causation. And the other lesson that is that nominal variables can be extremely dangerous. So any arguments any argument that relies on nominal variables should be taken with a grain of salt, which is also implying that simplistic arguments can be extremely dangerous for policy prescriptions. And so whenever we hear a simplistic argument at the base of a policy prescription, we should take note and we should be analyzing with a lot more care. Now, that said, the mercantilist claim was that the low value of silver, which means high prices, imply high wealth. So the higher are the prices, the higher is the wealth. So the wealthier you are. And so they also prescribed as a policy that the best way to increase wealth is to increase prices. And how do we increase prices? Through monopoly and trade restrictions. So the mercantilist argument looks at the value of silver over time and wealth over time and see that both increase. And therefore, they're saying having monopoly and trade restrictions will increase prices, which will increase wealth in a country. And the evidence that mercantilists give is that in the past 4 centuries, or even earlier than that, the value of silver decreased over time, which means that prices increased and wealth increased. And Smith says, well, hold on a second, let's see if there is some truth in what you're saying. And Smith says, yes, it is true. In the past 4 centuries, prices have increased and wealth also have increased, but the increase in prices is a nominal only. So what the mercantilists are doing are concentrating only at nominal prices. The value of silver and economic growth moved simultaneously, but for different and independent reasons. And this is why I'm saying that Smith is pointing the finger to the fact that correlation is not causation. The problem is that the common observer, as he calls it, is fooled by the arguments that the mercantilists make to benefit themselves. On the other hand, another way of looking at the problem is through the philosophical analysis, through the philosophical eye, not through the common observer eye. And the philosophical aspect is what Smith offers. And I'm saying the philosophical analysis because for Smith, the philosopher is a person who is able to connect the dots, to see different things, putting them together in a way that is coherent, so it offers a theory. And so Smith offers this philosophical analysis, which means it's a different way of understanding the facts by not looking at nominal prices, but looking at relative prices instead. So instead of looking at the value of silver by itself, Smith says, compare the value of silver with other goods that have constant value, like corn. Corn in his language is our grains. It's a generic form for grains. And what Smith does is takes the 4 centuries where the mercantilists claim that there is an increase in prices and disaggregate it. So Smith disaggregates time and compare the value of silver with corn. And what he sees is that in the 15th and 16th century, the value of silver does increase. But this is caused by an increase in security and an increase in demand as a consequence. The increase in security is basically the collapsing of the feudal system that generates a much more stable environment for commerce to develop. And as a consequence, this increased security, this increased commerce increases demand. And so you have an increase in the value of silver because of the increase in demand for it. From 1570 to 1640, in the second period, for Smith, the value of silver actually decreases. And this is the only time in which the value of silver actually decreases. And the value of silver decreases because of the discovery of the mines in the Americas, and therefore the large increase in supply of silver. But what the mercantilists did was to take this period basically and expand it to cover the previous period and the following period. The following period for Smith is from 1640 to 1700, in which the value of silver is basically constant. And it's basically constant because, yes, there is an increase in supply, but at the same time, there's also an increase in demand. And the two more or less cancel each other out. The increase in demand is due to the expansion of markets. Now you have all the markets in the colonies, both east and west, and therefore you have a higher demand for silver. In the years of the 18th century, so from 1700 to 1764, which is when Smith stops his analysis, the value of silver increases, but it increases in Britain mostly because of subsidies to corn. And so what Smith is telling us is that a nominal increase in the price of silver, a nominal increase in prices is actually not necessarily constant over the 4 centuries. So the value of silver decreased, but first increased, then yes, decreased, but then it stayed constant, and then it increased again. Right? So the claim that for 4 centuries there has been a decrease in the value of silver is just not right. Furthermore, Smith tells us prices can increase independently from silver. So it's not just because of the presence of silver that the prices are changing. Prices can change just because there is a change in demand and a change in supply of the actual good. So for example, corn. The price of corn can go up or can go down depending on the weather. And in particular, the price of corn can increase because of bad weather. It's a short-term change in price. The price of cattle can also increase independently from the value of silver. The price of cattle increases with economic growth. So the more a country develops, the higher is the population that is associated with this economic growth, the more people want to be fed and want to be fed well, and so the proportion of cattle to people is going to change, is going to decrease, which means that the price of cattle actually increases. Prices can increase also because, again, with an increase in wealth, people may want to have more luxury goods. And so if you look at the prices of exotic birds or the prices of exotic fish, those are going to increase with economic growth because they're exotic. They're exotic birds and fish. They're luxury goods with very limited supply. And so with limited supply and an increase in demand, you're going to have an increase in the price independently from the change in the value of silver. Similarly, the price of wool or raw hides is going to vary independently from the value of silver because there are special interest groups behind them. So there are special interest groups that lobby to obtain protection for wood and raw hides to change the price independently from the value of silver. So for Smith, the claim that the presence of more gold and silver is going to benefit a country is completely fake. And the only advantage that a larger quantity of gold and silver can bring is cheaper plate, which means cheaper silverware, but that's about it. Low money prices, which the mercantilists claim are a sign of poverty, is actually not a sign of poverty, according to Smith. Low prices does not imply poverty, while high money prices do not imply wealth. So the two things are actually independent from each other: the price, nominal prices, and the quantity of silver. Sorry, the money prices and the economic growth. What did happen are two simultaneous and unrelated events, Smith says. First, there was economic growth due to the security caused by the fall of the feudal system. The feudal system for Smith was a highly unstable system. Population were constantly at war. Property rights were not secured, and as a consequence, growth was damped. But with the collapse of the feudal system, you are able to have more secure laws, more secure enforcement of property, the development of a judicial system that is more reliable and more independent, and therefore you're able to have economic growth. This has nothing to do with the discovery of the mines in America. And so, true, there was an increase in the values in the quantity of silver, and therefore a decrease in its value due to the discovery of the mines, which happened to take place at the same time in which the feudal system collapsed and more security emerged. But the two were completely independent. And the problem of mercantilism is that they see the correlation and they put causation on top by claiming that the discovery of the mines and so the decrease in value of silver is actually what caused economic growth. So to conclude, the digression of silver for me is a jewel in the Wealth of Nations and should be read because in it Smith shows that the mercantilist arguments are based only on nominal prices and on simple correlations, which means that the mercantilists are able to fool the common observer to support their policies that benefit themselves, the mercantilists, at the expense of society. And this is a very, very dangerous thing to do, and Smith wants to warn us against it. So this is my contribution.
Thank you so much, Professor Maria Pia. Thank you so much for this interesting contribution. Unfortunately, we cannot see your screen, but it was Also
Sorry for that.
interesting. No problem. I know that it happens, so all of us need to be resilient in these times, but it was a really interesting intervention of yours. So thank you so much in the name of all the organization for this really interesting